Some people meet death with open arms, and thank God their time has come. Others beg to be spared for just one more day, saying there's much to be done. But if we, before performing an act, would stop and think of death, of judgment, and of all such things, I'm sure we would do our best, so that when our time comes, we may say, "Take me, Lord, without delay." She was 16 when she wrote that poem. These girls have lived with this all of their life. I've lived with the loss of my best friend, my sister, all my life, and I will carry that. They also have pain they are carrying. And there needs to be a world, there needs to be a place that we live in where people want to see something done about that.
Hello and welcome to Real Crime Profile. This is Jim Clemente, former New York City prosecutor and retired FBI profiler. And with me today from London is...
Laura Richards, former New Scotland Yard criminal behavioural analyst, advocate, author and founder and director of Paladin National Stalking Advocacy Service.
And I am Lisa Zambetti. I'm the casting director for Criminal Minds, where Jim Clemente is my colleague, and I have a real interest in real crime and the minds that solve those crimes.
So today we're going to continue our coverage of the Netflix series The Keepers. And we're now going to be talking about episode 2. Episode 2 starts with the revelation from the cliffhanger on episode 1. And that is the existence of a anonymous victim, somebody who'd come forward before in the 1992 to 1994 time frame as Jane Doe.
And I have to give a shout out to the director who we haven't talked about yet, Ryan White, who this is his documentary. You know, he really throws us a curveball because lo and behold, in episode 2, he has found Jane Doe and he starts to interview her, and he brings old Tom Nugent in to actually ask her about that time and what she witnessed. So then her face is revealed. And if I had to guess this, I couldn't help but thinking she looks like Frances McDormand to me, Jim.
Really?
Do you know who that is? Just very open, understanding face that looks like she's been through a lot.
I totally thought she was Glenn Close.
Oh, yes. Glenn Close. Yes. Yeah. That's a good one. Okay.
Wow.
Sorry.
I actually got casting right.
You outcast me. Yes, that's right. That's right.
When you see her pictures from when she was younger, again, you know, she was very attractive, and she still is now in terms of her age. And I know one of our Twitter followers said that her friend is the niece of the original Jane Doe. So it's Jean Hagdem Weiner. And, you know, she comes across to me as somebody who's very credible just when you first start to hear her speak. And she says very clearly that it wasn't a stranger who killed Kathy Selznick, and that she was going to talk and expose what was going on. And they used her death to keep Jean quiet. So it's quite a dramatic twist here, and incredibly significant what she says.
Absolutely. I mean, it was shocking.
But one of the significant things she does say, which is striking as a context, is that her father was a policeman. And not only him being a policeman, that their family was very religious as well. And the Catholic faith was a key part of her family growing up. And certainly that her brothers were altar boys, and that her father bestowed upon them that to be an altar boy, it was a real honor and a privilege. And that you would not ask questions of priests, and that her mother was a true Christian as well. So right away, you've kind of got this understanding that this was very much in her family, her culture, her childhood. But I think her father being a police officer is another key part to the unraveling of what happened to her.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is an important context here. Boy, when we talk about this kind of topic, it it hits very close to home for a lot of people, myself included. But when Jean actually talks about, she basically introduces us to two priests that were present at the school. And those priests were Father Magnus and Father Maskell. And unfortunately, Jean believed that she needed to go to confession. And when she did, she told the priest something, and he did something that priests are not supposed to do, that violates the sanctity and the privacy of the confessional. And he said, "What you did was so bad, I need to see your face and see who you are."
How rare is that, Jim? Would a priest ever do that?
No, they're not supposed to do that, period. Now, there's a new kind of sort of confession that's sort of open, that happened sort of in the 80s, and but this isn't what was happening then, and he totally violated her. They're supposed to have anonymity. It's supposed to actually encourage people to come forward with their, quote, sins. But what he did was clearly exploitive, and it's proven by the fact that what followed. So he asked her to come out of the confessional, and he basically said to her, "What you did was so horrible that I'm going to have to think about it. I'm not going to be able to forgive you. God can't forgive you, but I'm going to work on it." And then he would use that and her guilt over this sin and how he treated her about it. He used that to force her into sexual victimization. He coerced her into sexual victimization and did horrific things. And I'm sorry, this is very graphic, but I'm going to say it because this needs to be said. And he would sexually victimize her at school, and he would use his cum to make the sign of the cross on her and said that this was blessing her. And he would make her do things and saying that was getting the evil out of her. It's just so fucking outrageous. I can't say enough how this young, innocent, nice, wonderful girl, how her life became a living hell for years, and in fact decades later, because of this priest, because he took advantage of the sacred position that he had and the authority, the overwhelming authority that priests exercise over students in a Catholic school. Just outrageous. It pisses me off.
What kills me is that she was already a victim, and that's what is just so disgusting to me.
That was the revelation,
right?
yes.
So that's what she tells him in the confessional, which is hard enough as it is. I mean, that is
to
disclose that she had been being sexually abused by a family member, by her uncle, and then he uses that. Her worst fear is that God won't forgive her, and he reinforces that. And I have to tell you, when Jean is telling this story to the documentarian, and I had to rewind it and re-listen because she just says out of nowhere that his cum was Eucharist. And I was like, wait, I didn't hear that. I don't understand what she's saying. And I had to listen to it again because that leap in the story was just a punch to the gut.
That priest, that disgusting excuse for a human being, he used that for his sexual pleasure. And he used her. I mean, he just totally abused her and his authority and the church and everything about God. He used that to poison her brain and to manipulate her into this coercive sexual relationship.
Well, he exploited her vulnerability, and of course, that's what we see true predators do, being able to understand vulnerability, understand an opportunity, and then exploit it. And I think when you put it against the backdrop of what we learn about Keogh, the actual school itself, of it being described as the jewel in the crown, how prestigious it was, and how everyone wanted to go there, and that it had incredible nuns, and then Maskell the chaplain, and you see all these pictures of all these smiling girls and photos of gyms and science departments, and this is women of the new age, and it was all made out to be this incredible school. And sort of it ends with, this was meant to be a safe place, which of course it absolutely wasn't. And that vulnerability and coercion that has been absolutely exploited here, and him telling her that this is therapy, and that the even, again, to get into the detail of it, but basically saying to her that that she should take the Holy Spirit through his penis, and just the whole way these things have been described to her, and then bringing in Maskell, which of course we then hear about the chaplain Joe Maskell, who priest Neil Magnus brings into the room, and he is out and out calling her a whore and talking to her in a very different way from very early on. And she says, these were two men of great size, and they were powerful as they represented God, and she had been taught to respect God and to respect men, and men like her father. And the fact that her father, being a police officer, is used to coerce her again by saying that her father would treat her in exactly the same way if he knew what had gone on. And this real power and control and fear dynamic really kicking in and exploiting such a vulnerable and naive, child who knows no different.
And who can she turn to? No, nobody.
The people that she turned to, the people that she was supposed to turn to,
right.
for help, and instead they exacerbated the issue, re-victimized her literally and figuratively, and then passed her on to other people. This is just outrageous conduct. This is something the church should have exposed to the world immediately. It should have shut it down. But this is not the only time this has happened. This is not the first time, nor will it be the last time that the church has done this kind of thing. I went through the same kind of thing. I went to the priest counselor at my high school to tell him that I was sexually victimized by the director of the camp that I went to, that he sent me to, by the way. And he told me, I absolve you of your sins, say 10 Our Fathers and 10 Hail Marys, and never speak of this again. What I didn't understand at the time was that not only did that make me feel more guilty, but he's the one that sent me to the camp. What I didn't know was that he, Father Francis Stinner, the guidance counselor at John S. Burke Catholic High School in Goshen, New York, was molesting other boys in my class and the classes before and after that. And so finally, actually, this past month, the church has finally reached out to victims of Father Stinner and is settling with them. This is 40 years old, 42 years later, 43 years later. We just celebrated our 40th high school reunion last month. And now the church is actually addressing this 40 years later. It's outrageous. It's just, I'm sorry, but I don't know how anybody can trust a church that does that to its own parishioners, that does that to children, the most vulnerable Catholics there are, that does that to them, and then instead of helping them, hides behind rules and dogma and all sorts of things, brings in, these archdiocesan lawyers to protect the church, as opposed to protecting the children that they're supposed to care for. I'm sorry, but in that case, the guy who molested me was at 13 different Catholic schools over 23 years. Every time there was an allegation, he was allowed to resign. He went down the street and did it again and again and again. And I don't know who was personally responsible for that, but I know there were human beings who were in that church, who were lawyers, who were administrators, who were bishops, who were priests, who were any kind of administrators in that church who knew about this and let it go on. Year after year, decade after decade, hundreds of victims over the course of those years. It's despicable.
And yet he absolved you of your sins. I'm so sorry that happened to you, Jim. It breaks my heart. And do you have a sense of how these priests communicate to each other? I mean, is it something that they plan, do you think? Or is it just implied and it just sort of, that's the thing I can't understand. Like, do they talk about it, or are they just left in a room with a child and it's just understood?
No, I think there's several different pathways that priests take into victimizing children. I think some people who went into the priesthood actually felt like they were dedicated to the church and to helping others, and they became situational offenders. That is, they were put in a situation where they were not given access to normal sex. That was taken away from them, and it was just too compelling, and that they were drawn to do it. I think those are situational offenders. But the preferential offenders, these are people that recognized in late adolescence that they were sexually attracted to kids, and they may have gone to the church to try to avoid having sex with kids because they knew that there was this, I believe, ridiculous thing about not having sex because you're a priest. I just don't understand it. I know that it actually entered the Catholic Church in an effort to prevent priests from having children who would then inherit
Yeah.
the church properties. So who would have a claim towards inheriting the church property. So they started celibacy, I think it was in the 1700s. But anyway, be that as it may, modern priests went into the priesthood because they wanted to avoid sexually victimizing kids. But the attraction was too great when they were there. And I think others became a priest and discovered that this is something that they were attracted to, and they just went full force, used their position, and took advantage of it. I think those kinds of priests who are preferential sex offenders, who are sexually attracted to children, whether that's actually exclusive or non-exclusive, that they're attracted to children and they embrace it. And I believe they, in casual conversation, in some way, broach the subject with each other. I believe that's what happened with Magnus and Maskell, that they must have talked to each other about it, and then Maskell basically took over for Magnus and started elevating the victimization of Jean, and it's just horrible. And Maskell said to Jean that if her father ever found out that she was whoring around, do you see the subtlety in that, Laura? How it makes her even more fearful that her father would find out, that him sexually assaulting her was her fault and her whoring around. In fact, if her father found out, I don't have any doubt that her father would have killed Father Maskell and Father Magnus. Her father would have done anything in his power to stop it. But he made it sound to Jean like the opposite would happen, that she would be punished, that she would be seen as the bad person. And just, again, the number of levels that this manipulative asshole bastard took advantage of this poor girl, and many others we'll find out, is just disgusting. Disgusting, and I can't believe that the church didn't immediately sever ties with him. This is just, well, you can tell I'm pretty fucking pissed.
Yeah. And so am I. And you've just, blown me away on lots of different levels, just, describing not just what happened here, but also your own experience as well, which is just a mirror. And of course, we know it happens to many. And the fact that they then try and project onto you, as the school counsellor did with you, Jim, and Camp, and the fact here with Jean, trying to make her feel that she should own this and take responsibility. And of course, all that does is isolate that person even more. So it's a very manipulative and clever tactic to ensure that somebody doesn't speak out and to buy their silence because they feel they have nowhere to turn, and they feel it's something that is unique to them. It's something that they have done and that they are to blame, and they feel ashamed and confused. Certainly Jean describes all of those things to the point that she disassociates from the whole thing to survive it. As we do hear later on, that her family, when she does talk about it, are incredibly supportive. Mm-hmm. We hear from her brothers, we hear from everybody who absolutely believed her. And of course, there are many victims who are not believed when they come forward. But in this case, it was abuse on multiple levels. And I have to say, to those who also weren't active in it, but were complicit because of their silence that colluded with it and allowed this to happen, I feel incredibly angry as well. And there's a quote from Albert Einstein, which basically, he said, the world is a dangerous place, not because of those who do evil, but because of those who look on and do nothing. And I believe there were many people who knew what was happening here, many people in authority. and many people who had a vested interest in keeping this hushed up and keeping these girls in absolute fear. It really pisses me off that there has been no justice in many senses for so many victims, and it's the same echo chamber of issues over and over again. But this level of coercion and just the level of manipulativeness to be able to hone in on a child's utmost fears and use their own family and everyone around them to silence them is just, unconscionable and asinine. It just makes me so angry.
Knowing she's laying out somewhere. After Kathy Sesnick died, he now had me hook, line, and sinker. And now the abuse became worse than it had ever been. There's a certain thing that you do in order to survive, and that is you leave it where it's at. You can't think it. You can't look at it. You can't do anything with it because except sever it away, put it in a box.
Yeah.
But what's stunning to me is how far he pushed this, where it's not just him abusing her or the other priest abusing her, but he brings in people from the community into the school to molest. I mean, this incredibly risky behavior he has absolutely no fear of as he brings these strangers in to have sex with her. And as we come to find out, other victims. I mean, what does that tell you about him? I mean, how do you...
Well, I'll tell you what it tells you. What it tells you is that he knows that he is a despicable person and he is looking for community. In other words, when these preferential offenders realize that they have this sexual attraction to children, they know they're pariahs. And their entire lives they feel shut off from the rest of the world. They're looking for somebody to share this with, somebody who actually feels the same way so they don't feel so bad about themselves. And so this is a community that flourishes online, but back in the day, they didn't have that. And so they look for people that they can interact with one-on-one. And I think that's what happened. Jean also says that one or more of these people that came in were actually police officers. At one point, she was raped by a police officer in uniform. And the fact is that if that were the case, we know that Father Maskell was the chaplain for the Air National Guard, for the Baltimore Police Department, for the Maryland State Police, and his brother was a Baltimore City police officer. And so he was a cop buff. He liked to carry a gun. He liked to feel that power. Power control is very important to him. And so what he did was he interacted with these people. He went on ride-alongs with them. He shot with them. He did all sorts of things with the police. And at some point, he must have, if this is all true, and it sounds true to me, but if this is all true, he must have started a conversation with one or more of these police officers, found out their sort of proclivity to want to have sex with young girls, and he gave them that opportunity. He may have also used it to manipulate them. In other words, once he did that, once he exposed them to that, once he was there in the room while he did something to this student, he probably had more power and control over them. And that was another way for him to ensure that he would never be exposed. Because if he had a cop on his side who was doing the same thing, that cop certainly wouldn't want to be exposed, so he would probably get rid of cases that came his way.
Do you differentiate?
That's right. Then
Sorry.
they're all in it together. And he was actively encouraging people, other, businessmen, police officers, actively encouraging them. And this was a pool of victims that he provided on tap. And I do think that, predators like this go to certain pools that they can fish in. And here you had lots of vulnerable young girls that he picked them out, those that he would abuse. He was a very manipulative predator. He would use a gun at times with Jean and tell her, pulled the trigger having taken the bullets out and said that her father wouldn't take the bullets out. He would norm the sex offending so that it just became, a normal thing, so that it wasn't a standout behavior. And I think that's, in a network where you bring people together, they make it out to be something that is just routine. But his levels of manipulation, studying psychology and getting his degree to counsel girls and, taking it to the next level of gynecology, but also bringing in some of their peer group. What really just stood out as well was using Lil Hughes, who he recruited as one of their friends to keep confidential notes on everybody, so that no doubt he could relive this over and over again.
Right, fantasy
She's
material.
typing out.
Right.
Absolutely. She's typing out his fantasy material, and she's bought into it because he made her feel special. Now, this tells us he can use his tools and tactics in different ways. That with her, yes, she talked about sometimes not having a memory about things, and that maybe, other things did go on to her too. But these are people that he sort of bought in and silenced in lots of different ways. And that tells me that the top level of manipulation and, what a true psychopath he is, of being able to keep all of this going and get people to buy into this code of secrecy and become complicit.
I wanted to ask you if you can differentiate his behavior at all from that of a pedophile to that of a sadist, because is it possible that he, it's not about the sex for him, but it's about the absolute hatred he has for the girls and just making them suffer in a way that they can never get over, and torturing their minds as well as their bodies.
Those are not mutually exclusive concepts.
Yeah.
He may have been sadistic, but he is certainly a pedophile, and we will learn more and more and more about what he did even preceding his tenure at this school. But the fact is, he gave this student who was transcribing the notes Coke in a paper cup every time, and he also did things to hypnotize her, and she said there were gaps in her memory. Maybe she was hypnotized, maybe she was drugged. Who knows how far he took it with her? But the fact is that we know that there are multiple victims, and we'll get into all the details of that later. But he also bought in. Now, usually, let me just take it aside here. There have been a number of cases where people, claim that there's, satanic ritualistic abuse and all this stuff. And usually they say that there are doctors and lawyers and cops and the mayor of the town that's all involved in that. And many times those things tend to undermine the credibility of those statements. But in this particular case, because he was the chaplain for the police department, and because we know for a fact that he did bring these girls to a gynecologist, and the gynecologist let him stay in the room, and in fact, he actually helped the girls get on the stirrups table. I mean, it's just outrageous. And the doctor, to justify this, said, well, when else would he have an opportunity to see women in this situation? In other words, naked women, see their genitals, be involved in this. Why the hell is he involved at all? And these are not women. These are girls. These are children. And it's just unbelievable that the gynecologist sent a letter of appreciation to the priest for referring clients to him. It's just outrageous. It's just outrage upon outrage upon outrage. And I can't believe that this was allowed to go on, and these poor girls, it was a society, it was a whole culture that was victimizing them. Nobody was standing out. And when you talk about what ended up happening to Sister Kathy, we have to talk about why that happened. And it's because it's very clear, based on the timing and the circumstances. It's because at one point, Sister Kathy saw Jean go into Father Maskell's office, and she stopped her. And she said, wait a minute, I didn't know you needed these kind of services. And Jean, of course, didn't know what to say. She was caught between a rock and a hard place. So Sister Kathy asked Father Maskell, I didn't know that Jean needed these services. And he said, oh, yes, they're very, very effective. It's going very well. And then he closed the door on her and shut her out. And sometime later, at the end of the school year, Sister Kathy didn't know anything at that point, but she had a feeling, and it bothered her enough to ask Jane Doe or Jean if anybody was making her do something that she didn't want them to do. And Jean couldn't speak it, but she nodded her head. And then she said, is it the priest? And Jean nodded her head again. And Kathy said, oh, dear God, I thought as much. I want you to go home and have a wonderful summer. I'm going to take care of this. But when Jean came back for the summer, that's not what happened. What happened was Sister Kathy was no longer at the school. And Father Maskell confronted Jean, and said that someone had approached him over the summer and said he was hurting girls and making them do things they didn't want to do. He asked if it was her. She said no, but he said, I think we need to reacquaint you with who the real whore is in this room. Then he sodomized her. Then he said, now get yourself together and get out of this room. You just remember who's got the whoring mouth in this room. Again, on top of outrage, another outrage. She tried to get help. Sister Kathy tried to confront him about it, and he was so bold. Maybe that's why Sister Kathy left this school. Maybe she was forced out of the school. I don't know what happened. The circumstances obviously are up in the air, but she at least tried. She probably was very constrained by the fact that she was a nun. And nuns, although they are religious, they are nowhere near on the same plane as a priest. Priests rule over nuns. In the Catholic Church, it's another issue that I have with the Catholic Church in general, that women are treated as second-class citizens, if second-class, maybe even lower than that. They can never attain the level of priest. They could never be Jesus-like and be a priest. They have to have a subservient position to priests, and I think that's probably why she couldn't do anything about it.
I severed a part of me and it stayed in that school. And I walked out, dusted my feet as I was told to do, and I buried it. And it didn't come back up until 20-some years later.
Yeah, it seems the other sisters were afraid of Father Maskell as well, and they seemed to be hoping that it wasn't true, but they seemed to know that when a girl's name was called over the loudspeaker, I mean, can you imagine that something bad was going to happen to them? And the reign of terror, how terrifying that must have been to hear your name. I mean, what do you think, Laura?
And know what's going to happen next. And I think that silence in a classroom of them all looking round at each other and knowing, and the fact that it's blatant and overt, calling them in over the tannoy, and one of the nuns saying, oh, I know he's weird. Now, that kind of stuff is the soft intel. I know he's weird. Well, no, it's much more than that, a euphemism. But, I wrote, how can he just be calling them in one by one? But, of course, that fear is what silences people, and that power, as Jim described, he was the chaplain there. He had managed to get himself a counselling certificate. He'd shown the girls the film Marnie, which had Sean Connery, I believe, in it, which was about a woman who had been abused and then turns to her counsellor for help. He's setting, the scene so that he is the one in ultimate control and power. And, Sister Kathy, we have to remember, is still very young. Right. She's been there for a couple of years, but she's 26, 27. I mean, how do you tackle this kind of issue when you've got someone who's so manipulative and controlling at the top of the tree? She's then finding out from other girls, that she was told that Maskell isn't religious and that he got physical with her. And so she's joining all these dots together and probably not really knowing how to handle it when you've got someone like Maskell, who weirdly enough becomes the protector of some of the girls, in that when he introduces other people, and we hear about this brother Bob, who takes on another very sinister tone, but he talks about, Jean, and says, be careful with this one, she's a pup of all the pups, i.e. he's basically saying, about pregnancy, not wanting to get her pregnant. And then, ironically, Jean and the other girls look to him as almost being the protector of them. So again, this psychology that he's set up, because he understands power and control and he understands people's weaknesses, and the fact that people don't challenge him means that he can, get away with doing all of this in plain sight. And that's what just makes me so angry, that, where is the redress? Where do these girls go to? And the very person that they confide in then just disappears.
Right.
How terrifying is that?
Yeah, and speaking of that, the disappearance of Sister Kathy, the night before she died, Maskell and Magnus both just walked into her apartment without knocking, and they were furious. There was another student there at the time, and that student was sent away. But the next day, when Jean went to school, Maskell called her into his office and said, "If you say anything, I'll kill you and your family." And that's the evening that Kathy disappeared.
Yeah, it seems like the students, even though Kathy had left Kehoe, they were still coming to her in her apartment to tell them that things were still going on. It seems like this is what the anonymous student and her boyfriend say.
Right.
That happened.
And so this is when Father Koob comes back into play here, because he said that Kathy had told him that she wanted to get together to talk about something very serious. Now, he, at the time, thought it was about their relationship because, in fact, they were both at a turning point in their career where they were going to give their lifelong vows very shortly. And Father Koob said that he actually had developed such a love and such a relationship for Kathy that he wanted to marry her, and he proposed to her. And she turned him down and said, "No, you're supposed to be a priest and I'm supposed to be a nun." But at that time, they must have had a really close relationship. And we can talk a little bit about that, about when Father Koob was recounting that. I just remember watching his verbals and nonverbals and seeing that he was sort of embarrassed, but the thought of it was he kind of looked on it in a very nostalgic way. If, as some people have suggested, that he could have been the killer, I think there would have been some anger for that rejection, because the rejection would have been the impetus for it. But he thought at the time that she was going to talk to him about their relationship. But now in hindsight, because he didn't know anything was going on sexually with these kids, now that he knows, he figures that's probably what she wanted to have a conversation about, but the conversation never happened.
Yeah, I think that them going round there, well, first of all, Kathy calling him, obviously he was slightly older, and as you said, they had a very close relationship. So who does she turn to discuss what's going on? It's more than likely going to be him. He's a priest, and you can see he's a compassionate person. And I agree with you, Jim. You can see how fondly he thinks back of her, about their relationship. You can see him kind of reliving some of it in his head, and that he was prepared to give up being ordained for her, but she didn't feel the same and felt they should be on their same pathways, as in to be, on the religious track rather than be together. But I have no doubt that she loved him, just from some of those little things that we understood and learned, and from the poem. But I think her calling him, no doubt he did think that she had changed her mind. Why would he suspect that the conversation was going to be anything other? Because she did say it was important. But I think of significance that night too is Magnus and Maskell going round to the property, unannounced, and no doubt angry and wanting to remonstrate. And the student that was there, and he came forward later on, I believe, saying that she was there. And of course, that account is very significant given what unfolds. So this kind of almost getting to know Kathy, and that there was a romance, but not quite a romance, almost Thornbirds-esque. But how different, I wonder, life may have been had they have taken that decision. And no doubt he relives that in his mind over and over, about how different their lives would have turned out maybe had they have agreed to get married and left. And it would be a very different story, wouldn't it?
Well, it is interesting that Sister Russell, when Kathy does disappear, the first person she calls is Jerry Koob, and maybe thinking that they are together that evening and went out together or something. And I'm not sure the timeline. I'm not sure the timeline when he proposed to her, if it was before or after she left Kehoe, because certainly leaving Kehoe and having an apartment, that tells me she's moving away from the idea of, I don't know, something to me says that maybe she was testing out,
distancing
this
herself.
Possibility.
It is. We don't know the impetus, and again, it's also the timing of it. She clearly confronted Maskell. So when you confront the priest that basically runs the school that you're working at, and then you're no longer at that school, it sounds like she was just unequivocally shut down, and so she had to try to find another way. What happened after this, sometime in the days after Sister Kathy goes missing, is that Father Maskell calls in Jean, or Jane Doe, and says, Kathy is missing, but I can take you to where she is. She then, of course, thinks that she's going to go see Kathy and gets in his car. He drives her to a remote area, and there was a clump on the ground. And there were maggots on her face. She said she was frantically wiping her face, asking him to help her. And he said, he leaned down and whispered in her ear, do you see what happens when you say bad things about people? The ultimate threat against her life, against her family, against her close friend, Sister Kathy. It's just outrageous. Again, this does not stop. It's unrelenting. And this is why, over and over and over again, I found myself cursing at the TV as they depicted these despicable excuses for human beings and how they took advantage of these girls in such just a horrific way. It's just disgusting to me.
And now she feels this is her fault. You know, that is very firmly planted in her head, that it's her fault that this happened. And of course, the girl that was sent out of Kathy's apartment, you know, the night before when Maskell and Magnus went round there, she never disclosed because he threatened her too. So he has learned throughout his career and throughout all of these events how to control people and girls, you know, women, and no doubt some men in there too. By what he says, he's become very effective at doing that. And of course, this has a profound effect and impact on Jean, or Jane Doe, in what we understand in episode 3 about the repressed memories and the trauma, etc., and how she managed to survive this terrible childhood experience and what she goes on to do with her life.
A couple of things that struck me: that he has no fear of being caught or connected to the crime, and he has no fear of her as a witness at all. And I'm wondering if you think that the place where he brought Jean to see Kathy's body, if that's not the dump site that they found her later. It felt to me like it was a different place.
No, I believe it's the same place.
Oh, you do? Okay.
I believed it was the same place as well, from how she described it.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing about it that told me it was a different location, and moving a body is very risky. Why would you move a body from one remote location to another remote location? Doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, and a lot is made of, Jean says that she sees maggots on Kathy's face. Whether she saw maggots or flies or I don't know, but you know, she talks about brushing.
Well, you don't have to worry about that because later the documentary series actually answers that question.
Right, I know. So yeah, so that brings us almost to that's the end of episode 2, and oh my gosh, I feel like I've been put through the ringer talking about it again. But when we come back, we will continue talking about the keepers and move on to episode 3. Anything else you guys want to say before we sign off?
I just want to say to our listeners, it's not like I'm attacking people who are Catholics. People who believe and who are wonderful people and who love God and are part of the church because they believe that that's the right thing to do. What I'm attacking is the administration of the church, the leadership of the church, the corrupt morals of the people who claim to have been protecting these children when in fact they were taking advantage of them. I'm talking about the offenders now, and then also the corrupt morals of the people who felt that it was more important to protect the image of the church than to protect the victims of sexual victimization by priests. They should be ashamed of themselves. Hopefully, today, that's not happening. I'm not sure one way or the other, but I hope it's not happening today.
You know, certainly the tools and tactics of abusers. I mean, we see this time and time again, but some girls, he would make them feel important, as we heard from Lil Hughes. And for others, he would give them, you know, alcohol and cigarettes and allow them to take drugs. So there was an element of grooming and giving them the things that they felt that they needed or wanted. And then with others, he would abuse sexually and psychologically, and he would call these things therapy and guidance. And I just think the range of tools and tactics, and of course we know perpetrators use charm too, and I think it was quite evident from those who did meet Maskell that, when he was giving, or when there was a sermon, or when he was talking, that people found his voice very comforting and reassuring, and this power that he exuded then. And he did find him reassuring, and he was in that absolute position of trust. That's the part that is just absolutely unconscionable, and the concentric circles of all those who knew that something wasn't right, that things were going on, and yet they were silent and colluded with it.
And to your point, Jim, it's not just the Catholic Church or churches in general, but it's, institutions that make this environment. Right, Laura? I mean, there's a sort of an institutional coercive control depending on the structure, or how they kind of prime people to be victims in a way, because the victims need something from the institution, or are held in power by them.
It's the power, and that's the thing, the power and control. And of course, with religion and, in other institutions, it attracts very vulnerable people at times. But, children are vulnerable, and they were in a position of trust, and they abuse that in every way possible. And, that is the biggest crime in many senses. And those who did try and speak out, well, I certainly believe that Sister Kathy did. And look what happened to her. So the message that sends to everybody else is, guess what? That on its own sends a very clear message to people. And, we know abusers don't abuse all of the time. And they pick. We had a big case over here of Jimmy Savile. We've also had the care homes. One such up in Rotherham was recently in the news, and a docu-drama was made on it called The Girls Betrayed, which was about child sexual exploitation. And those who are vulnerable being given phones, or being given drugs or alcohol, or being made to feel special. It's exactly the same thing, this concept of grooming. And normally there are multiple concentric circles around it of people who know. But it's incredibly brave for the victims to come forward and speak out. And of course, as an advocate, I was always encourage people and empower them to talk to somebody. It's not always going to be the police. So if you are listening and this has impacted on you, you or your family, well, we'll put the usual numbers up for some of the support services, and we're also going to be talking to somebody who's an advocate and specialist in this area too, because unfortunately, as Jim knows, this is very prevalent, and 90% of sexual abuse is committed by someone known. And as we heard from Jean, it was her uncle in her family, and then for it to happen a second time, well, that's not uncommon, because there's still this vulnerability that someone carries with them that a predator absolutely picks up on and hones in on. But it's not always the case. But a number of these girls had been victimized previously. So we do want to make sure that, if that is you and you haven't spoken about it, people keep these secrets for years and for decades, and the trauma, the post-traumatic stress that can emanate from that. And I want to get into that, in the next couple of episodes, of really talking about PTSD, and also talk about some of the things that are proving to be really effective to deal with trauma.
I'm so glad you're going to talk about that. That's going to be very important, I know, to many of our listeners who've, already been reaching out to us.
So thank you for listening to this very contentious episode of Real Crime Profile. We hope that you take it for what it's meant to be, and that is outrage at offenders who took advantage of children over and over and over again, and unfortunately were never shut down.
If you like our podcast, there are a few things that you can do. You can take 2 minutes and go to Apple Podcast and leave us a 5-star review. You can also check out all Real Crime Profile offers and promotion and our sponsors in our show notes. Another thing you can do is go over to Facebook and like our Facebook page. And one last thing is, please tell all your friends, family and colleagues about us and spread the Real Crime Profile word. Thank you so much for listening to us. We really appreciate you.
Real Crime Profile is produced and edited by Paul Francis Sullivan. Sound engineered by Terrell Parham. Music composed by Simba Tsumba. Logo art by Jim Clemente. Real Crime Profile is produced by XG Productions and distributed by Wondery.
For advice and support if you're experiencing stalking in the UK, you can contact Paladin National Stalking Advocacy Service on 0203 866 4107, or you can go on the website www.paladinservice.co.uk. If you're experiencing domestic violence, call the National Domestic Violence Helpline, free phone 0800 2000 247. In the US, if you're experiencing domestic abuse and need advice, safety, shelter or counselling, call Genesis, the 24-hour hotline, 214-946-4357, or go on their website www.genesisshelter.org or the domestic violence hotline on 800-799-7233.